Hi, I'm Ron, and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. In case you're new to this channel, I'm a biologist by profession. I'm a biology teacher as well, but I also consider myself to be a student of popular culture, whether it's cinema, which is my ultimate passion, music, series, anime, RPGs, video games, etc. etc. So in this channel, I try to combine my interests in science, particularly biology and popular culture, to come up with some very interesting topics that I hopefully you've enjoyed if you've been following my channel. But if you're new to this channel, then hopefully you'll find something of interest here. In this episode, I'm going to talk about, and my shirt is perfectly indicative of this topic, Doctor Who. But in particular, I'm going to talk about the biology of the Time Lords. Anyone who has been watching Doctor Who, even just a few episodes, would know that the Time Lords, of which the Doctor is one, are very unique in terms of their behavior, in terms of their culture, in terms of their ability to travel through space and time, particularly with the TARDIS or an equivalent thereof, but also, of course, because of their physiology. There are many things in Doctor Who lore that we can talk about regarding the biology of the Doctor and the Time Lords. There's their invulnerability, their physiological capability to travel through space and time, as I had mentioned, um, their unusual abilities like being able to fly, which some sources or some variations of the Doctor Who's story or the franchise have hinted at them being able to do, but I don't think we ever got to see that. Their sensory structures and capabilities. Various sources have said that they are uh, they have very keen senses compared to humans, and many other things that differentiate a Time Lord from a human. However, because there's so much deviation and so much variation from source to source with regard to that, and we don't really highlight those when it comes to the main series that we've been following, except probably some signs of invulnerability here and there. I won't be covering those. Instead, I will be covering the two physiological or biological properties of the Time Lord, particularly of the Doctor, that are very often mentioned. One is that Time Lords have two hearts, and the other one is their capability to regenerate, and that is uh, why Time Lords are largely considered to be immortal. And we've seen many phases of the Doctor. Let's start with their having two hearts. This is something that is very often mentioned, whether as a joke or in all seriousness. But really, it sets apart the body, the anatomy of a Time Lord from that of a human. Humans do not have two hearts. No living vertebrate, for that matter, on Earth has two hearts. And by vertebrates, we mean those animals that are known to have a vertebral column and the cranium. Um, and so it is an oddity, especially if we consider that Time Lords, by and large, are very human in appearance. Then, except for that, for having two hearts, they're very human. On Earth, there are actually several animals that have more than one heart. The earthworm is one example with at least 5 different hearts, each one in a different segment. And that's one thing about earthworms that you must know about. They belong to a group of segmented worms called Annelida, and this segmentation, which is also called metamerism, is a very important modification that allows them not only some level of protection, because if one segment and one heart gets injured, the other ones can carry on the function, but also in terms of localizing movement, because then, because of the segmentation, the earthworm is able to localize movement in particular segments only, and that is why the earthworm moves in a characteristic manner, unlike a roundworm which doesn't have segments. So when one part of the roundworm moves, the whole worm moves. It's not able to localize movement in certain segments. Anyway, that's sort of going away from the, or veering away from the main topic. I just wanted to let you know that there is segmentation and the segmentation in earthworm extends to the number of hearts that they have. Squids also have multiple hearts. They have 3 hearts. And all of these hearts, regardless of what animal you're talking about, as long as an animal has some sort of a heart, then that means that that heart is responsible for circulating the blood. And that's why it's a main part of what we call the circulatory system. Now, for more derived or newer vertebrates like mammals and birds, which are both derived from the reptile lineage, they've evolved to have a specialized type of heart which has 4 chambers. Those of you who have gone through some level of biology in elementary school or in high school would know this. There are 4 chambers to the typical mammalian and bird heart, which are the left and right atrium on the top and the left and right ventricle on the bottom. And this having a 4-chambered heart is a special evolutionary modification in birds and mammals that allows them to completely separate the flows of blood that are oxygenated and deoxygenated. One flow of blood goes through the right side of the heart, the right atrium and the right ventricle, and that is the deoxygenated blood, which means it doesn't have oxygen because all of the oxygen has already been taken in by the body tissues, which require that oxygen. And then the oxygenated blood is coming in through the left side of the heart, and it's oxygenated because that's blood that has come from the lungs, from which it has gotten the oxygen. The other major advantage of having 4 chambers to the heart is that it separates pulmonary and systemic circulation. Pulmonary circulation is circulation of the blood through the lungs, so from the heart to the lungs and back. And of course, when it's coming back to the heart and going into the left side of the heart through the atrium, it's carrying oxygen, and so it's oxygenated blood. And then there's systemic circulation, which is that circulation of the blood from the heart to the rest of the body except for the lungs and back to the heart. And so, because it's bringing oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, that those body tissues will be taking in the oxygen from the blood, then it will be coming back to the heart as deoxygenated blood and into the right side, which is consistent with what I had mentioned a while ago, with the left side carrying oxygenated blood and the right side carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, why all this biology? Why this reviewer on basic heart biology and circulation biology? I think that by virtue of having 2 hearts, it would be very efficient for a Time Lord to be separating the flows of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood between these 2 hearts. So one heart would be responsible for the flow of the oxygenated blood. The other heart would be responsible for the flow of oxygenated blood. Otherwise, you would have double the function, meaning each heart or the 2 hearts have the same function, and so you would require, or a Time Lord would require, double the number of arteries and veins that a human has. And that's very, very costly. Not only in terms of space, as you would imagine, but in terms of energy. Body structures, whether that's an organ or a tissue, and of course blood vessels are a very extensive network of body tissue running all over the body or inside the body, that would take up a lot of energy for upkeep. So it wouldn't make too much sense from a biological perspective for each and every artery, like for example, the carotid artery supplying the head, okay, and each and every vein, like for example, the jugular vein, draining the head region, to be double because of that cost that I was talking about. So it probably makes more sense. Of course, we're all being very speculative here, given that this is speculative biology. It probably makes more sense from an economic perspective that each heart will be responsible for one flow of blood. Could be one heart is responsible for pulmonary circulation, the other one is responsible for systemic circulation. Meaning that one heart takes the function of the right side, the right atrium and the right ventricle, and then the other side, the other heart takes the function of the left side, which is the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, as for why the Time Lord has 2 hearts in the first place, it could very well be that a single heart formed first, similar to what vertebrates on Earth have, and then later on it split. That's not too inconceivable given the origin of the heart in vertebrates on Earth, where it's a matter of production of muscle cells, and then splitting of muscle cells, and splitting of networks of veins and arteries during embryological development. So it's not altogether inconceivable for a single heart to have evolved first in the Time Lord and then split apart, given that they have distinct functions given the path of blood. Or it could be that they develop two hearts separately to begin with, but whatever the evolutionary origin of the hearts of Time Lords, it would make more sense if each heart were not as big as a normal human heart. So probably half, or a little larger maybe, but not too large, because again, the heart itself is actually a very uh, economically costly organ in terms of the amount of blood that it requires and the amount of oxygen that it requires. And that's understandable given the importance of its function in circulating the blood. It's a highly muscular organ that requires a lot of oxygen. So again, it would be very, very costly for a Time Lord to have two hearts of the same size, meaning of the same size as that of humans, quite large. So each heart of a Time Lord is probably quite small, maybe again half, given that one heart takes on the function of the right side and the other heart takes on the function of the left side. Now, from a functional perspective, one other possibility is that these two hearts are not carrying only blood and whatever is in the blood. Maybe one heart is responsible for circulating that energy that is responsible for the regeneration of Time Lords. We do know that there's that energy. We can see that every time the Time Lord regenerates, that flash of light. Maybe that's something that's also circulated by one of the hearts, while the other heart is responsible for flow of blood. In which case, maybe the heart that's responsible for regenerative energy is smaller than the heart that's responsible for blood circulation, which would probably be the same size as a human heart. But then again, that's just another possible interpretation. The regenerative energy could be something that's being transported in the blood, just like other metabolites, hormones, substances like waste products, ions that are normally transported by blood. It's really fun to think about the possibilities of Time Lord anatomy, especially because there's no canon, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything canon in terms of the anatomy and evolution of these parts. And now, the second most fascinating thing about Time Lord physiology is the regenerative capability. Now, we've said that Time Lords can be considered immortal because they can have several reiterations. If one form dies or gets severely injured, then regeneration can happen and a new Time Lord version or form is born. Now, what kind of regeneration is it really? In Earth biology, we do have a lot of animals that show some ability to regenerate. One of the most significant animals that show this is the salamander. The salamander is an amazing animal because it can regenerate lost limbs, particularly tails and legs, but it's also been determined to be able to regenerate parts of its brain, which is quite a rarity, even among a lot of other regenerative animals. The earthworm, which we've mentioned earlier, is also regenerative. Starfishes are regenerative. If you cut a starfish in half, as long as each half contains a part of the central disc of the starfish, then each half will regenerate lost arms. The hydra is another example, not the mythological hydra, but the small, almost microscopic hydra that is a close evolutionary cousin of jellyfishes and corals. It belongs to the phylum Nidaria, and it is quite known for being an animal that doesn't really die of old age. It isn't normally affected by what we call senescence effects. And one other fascinating thing about it is that it regenerates. In fact, regeneration is an ability for it that allows it also to reproduce, because whatever falls from the body of the hydra can become a new organism also. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. Going back to the salamander and its amazing regenerative capabilities, there are several things that explain that, like the nervous system, the circulatory system, the muscular system, stem cells also. But one of the major concepts that we have to invoke here, and this is going to be something that we'll go back to when we talk about Time Lord regeneration, is transdifferentiation. What is transdifferentiation? First of all, we have to take note that during the development of an animal, what happens to undifferentiated cells, meaning cells that haven't quote-unquote decided yet what they will become, whether an intestinal cell, a brain cell, a heart cell, whatever, will are bound to become differentiated or specialized. That's another term for it. That's really the fate of a cell. A cell starts off having no identity essentially, but eventually it will specialize or differentiate into a specific type of cell. Any of those that I've mentioned plus many others. And normally, once a cell has already specialized into a brain cell, an intestinal cell, a skin cell, an eye cell, it will no longer revert to the undifferentiated or unspecialized state. But transdifferentiation is the way by which a cell can do that. And we've determined that the salamanders are able to regenerate lost limbs through transdifferentiation, partly through transdifferentiation, because there are several other things that are going on. And so that's a powerful tool for organisms to use to be able to regenerate lost structures or damaged structures. Now, is that similar to what the doctor goes through every time he or she regenerates? Well, not exactly, but transdifferentiation is probably involved in some way. But we're not going to look at the salamander. What we're going to look at is another animal that a lot of biologists actually consider to be the only truly immortal animal. And this is the animal called Turritopsis dohrnii. Now, what is this animal? As you can see here, it looks like a jellyfish, right? It's not exactly a jellyfish. It belongs to the same phylum called Cnidaria, which I've mentioned earlier, but it belongs to a different subgroup or a different class, as we call it. It belongs to a class called Hydrozoa, whereas the group of true jellyfishes belongs to the group called Scyphozoa. Although generally now they're considered to be part of one big group called Medusozoa, because all of them produce that typical shape of a jellyfish-like organism that's called a medusa, which swims around. However, one differentiating thing between Hydrozoa and Scyphozoa, the true jellyfish, is that Hydrozoans spend more of their time attached to the ground as what you call a polyp, whereas Scyphozoans, the true jellyfishes, are often seen in that form because they spend most of their time in that medusa stage. Now, going back to Turritopsis dohrnii, it's not actually a Scyphozoan, it's a Hydrozoan. So this form that you see that looks like a jellyfish is just a transitionary form to what it spends most of its life in, which is that polyp stage that is attached to the ground. Now, what happens when it becomes a medusa? It starts off being a polyp, again attached to the ground, and then it will undergo a sexual reproduction to produce clones of itself, exact identical copies of itself, because just there's no sexual reproduction involved. It's just producing copies of itself. Each copy of itself will detach, and then that copy that has detached will become a medusa, so that it will be able to swim in the water, and that's the form that will produce the sex cells or the gametes, the sperm and the egg, to continue the lineage. Now, what normally happens with hydrozoans that do that is that the medusa, after producing its gametes, will die. A natural death, whether it's eaten or it will die of old age. However, in Turritopsis dohrnii, what happens is that the medusa, instead of dying, reverts back to the polyp stage. And that's through transdifferentiation. The cells that have already specialized or differentiated into medusa cells revert to become polyp cells again. And as far as we can tell, the Turritopsis dohrnii medusa can keep on doing that indefinitely. So the polyp gives rise to medusae, the medusa can go back to becoming a polyp, which can then produce a medusa again, so on and so forth. So essentially, unless it is eaten or severely injured, it will not die. It will keep on living and just going back and forth from medusa to polyp and vice versa. So now you can see where we're going here. If you look at the Time Lord regeneration, this is probably the closest thing that we can have to a biological explanation for it. And that would explain why their faces change, why their bodies change, why even their personalities change right? Because when a Time Lord in his or her current state is severely injured, then that regenerative energy has probably has a hand in the whole process. It's probably the one that will trigger the transdifferentiation, the despecialization, the reversion of the specialization of the cells. And then the next stage would be the specialization again into the same types of tissues that an adult Time Lord has. But instead of going back to this exact same conformation that they had prior to regeneration, it's a different conformation now that ultimately leads to differences in behavior and physical appearance. At the core, of course, the organism is still the same. Genetically speaking, it's still the same. So we won't be expecting DNA changes or significant DNA changes in different iterations of the doctor or the individual Time Lord. However, there would be phenotypic or physical changes because of the rearrangement of the cells and the molecules and what have you. It's an elegant explanation. It's a simple explanation. Of course, it's not exactly the same. But if you wanted to look for a true biological phenomenon on Earth that is as close as possible to capturing the essence of regeneration in a Time Lord, then you need not look far beyond the Turritopsis dohrnii or the immortal jellyfish. This is an idea that I thought of while thinking of the regeneration capabilities of the Time Lords. It's not only myself who has come up with the idea. Later on, after coming up with the idea, I discovered that several other people have had this idea also and have posted it on blogs online. But I decided to make this video anyway because it's a pretty darn interesting explanation for how Time Lords regenerate. And it's also a way for me to tell you how wonderful animals on Earth can be and are. Because I'm pretty sure that not many of you knew that there's that particular animal called Turritopsis dohrnii, a jellyfish-like creature that can actually be called immortal because of what it does, just reverting to its primitive form and going back to an advanced form and going back and forth. And I think that's a perfect example of how you can combine biology and your interest in science fiction and popular culture to make more sense of the things that you enjoy and to be able to appreciate them on a whole other level. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more, especially those at intersections between science and popular culture, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in the future. See you again next time!